All right, so while we're getting seated, there's plenty of seats over here. Come on in. So I'm Mike Fisher, I'm the CTO at Etsy. And people ask me, like, what's the culture like at Etsy? And I always say, come to a Coders Craft, because it is, sort of this manifestation of our culture. We have this inclusive, empowering learning culture that's reflective in the way we treat each other, especially when things go wrong. You may have heard of our Blameless Postmortems. If you haven't read that post, I highly recommend it. We're kind of famous for that. But it's also the way we work and on a daily basis. And it's reflected in the way we conduct our architectural reviews. We have an architecture review working group that consists of engineers and architects, not managers, who facilitate these architectural discussions with their peers and colleagues. And we do this in various formats. We do like a drop-in for office hours and workshops. And much like tonight, the whole purpose of this group is to bring together people who have knowledge and people who want that knowledge, and it's to share. And so I thank all of you for joining us tonight to share this knowledge. And if you'd like to learn more about our culture, this is my little plug. Find one of us afterwards. We're happy to talk about Etsy and the wonderful culture we have. But tonight we have a really wonderful speaker, Tanya Reilly. But first, we're going to do something a little different tonight. You might have noticed our stage setup is different. So Tanya is going to talk about her Squarespace RFC process, but we're going to have a moderator tonight. And she's going to join us for this Q&A session. And so our moderator for this evening is Katie Seiler-Miller, or KSM. And I'm going to introduce Katie, and then she's going to introduce Tanya, and we're going to take it from there. So KSM is a staff software engineer with us at Etsy and a front-end architect. She's been at Etsy for 4 years, and she is a member of that architecture working group that I mentioned. So she has deep knowledge about that, front-end technologies, and is really known as an expert in this field, both within Etsy and within the industry. She has participated, while at Etsy, participated in numerous projects. She was part of the team that helped remove all the blue and green from Etsy and make it the wonderful orange that we now know. She helped architect the first web toolkit that we lovingly refer to as V1 currently. She also re-architected the second web toolkit that we now call Collage. So she's been involved in tons and tons of projects, lots of performance work that has generated a lot of GMS for our sellers. So she's just been really instrumental in many, many ways. I cannot pass up mentioning that she is also the creator of Oh Shit Git, which I've seen people recognize her from that, which is amazing. But yeah, she's just a tremendous person on our team. Really wonderful to have her here in person to help moderate this. So please join me in welcoming KSM.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I have Oh Shit Git stickers with me, so come find me at the end and I will give you an awesome sticker. But enough about me, let's talk about Tanya Reilly. So I first came across Tanya on Twitter a couple of years ago, as you do. A bunch of people I knew sort of talked about her in New York City. Even though I don't live in New York, I live in Greater Boston. New York is such a small tech community. I knew tons of people who knew her, and she kept coming across my feed, and I went and took a look at her profile, and I saw things like first ever principal engineer at Squarespace, 12 years at Google doing infrastructure. I think you were a principal there as well. No? Oh, no? Okay. She's a keynote speaker. She's a prolific writer. She is a badass working mom. So I was like, boom, insta follow. And then about a year and a half ago, Tanya gave this talk called Being Glue. And I think that Being Glue is one of the top 10 tech talks of the last decade, and that literally everyone in this room, if you haven't seen it, you should go and watch it. You should look for it. It really, it changed my perspective on a lot of things that women in particular experience as software engineers. So I think if you're an engineer, if you're a manager, go and watch her talk. You will be very thankful that you did. Now, tonight, she's going to be talking about something completely different. As Mike said, we're going to talk about the architecture review process and the RFC process at Squarespace. She's going to drop a ton of really amazing knowledge and tell some really funny jokes. And then she and I are going to sit down and do a Q&A. So while you're listening, make sure to think about any questions that you might have for her, because at the end, we'll have a little Q&A with the audience. So with that, everyone welcome, please, Tanya Reilly.
Thank you. Softball questions only. Okay. So yeah, thank you for having me. This is really exciting. Do you know the thing where you've got a problem you want to solve? I imagine most of us at some point have solved problems, and you start thinking about it, like for example, when the clicker doesn't work. Clicker's gone again. Sorry. Well, we're gonna talk about something else for a moment. How is everyone? You know, good? Yeah? I'm pretty good, actually, yeah. Good Thanksgivings? Yeah? Let's try? Yes, okay, cool. So you're solving a problem. Thank you very much. You're solving a problem, and at the start, you're thinking a lot about how to solve it. You've got a lot of different thoughts, and over time, the thoughts start coming together. And finally, you kind of think you know how to solve it. It's a good feeling. Like you have an idea. And it might even be a great idea. You have this whole design in your brain. So what do you do then? Well, you could just build it. And I think I've seen people do this a lot. You know, you go off in a corner for a month or a quarter, and you churn away at the idea, and you refine it, and you perfect it, and you make it really beautiful. And then you emerge at the end, and you show it to other people. You tell your potential users. You tell other teams, you tell people who have software you might want to integrate with, you tell people whose opinions you respect, and maybe they love it. Like maybe they really do. Maybe it has exactly solved their problem. That happens sometimes. But what's more likely is that someone will say, this doesn't quite exactly fit my use case. Or, I don't get why this is useful. Why did you spend time on it? Didn't you? They look at the goals, and they look at the plan, and they look at the timeline, and they tell you if they like those goals or plans or timelines, and they leave some comments. And then you incorporate the comments into your doc, make it a little better, and then you build the thing, and everyone is happy, the end. That's it. Okay, that would be a really short talk, right? So I think writing RFCs is wonderful and brilliant and great, but I also think the process is a little more complicated than that. And we should talk about why. But first, I should do a bio. My name is Tanya. I'm principal engineer at Squarespace, which has its headquarters here in lovely New York City. Squarespace, well, you'll know if you've ever heard a podcast, but Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for domains, websites, online stores, and marketing tools. And we're hiring. I'm Where is Tanya on GitHub and Twitter, and I blog at noidea.dog, which is, of course, a Squarespace site. Before I go back to talking about RFCs, I want to acknowledge my domain bias, which is that I have been an infrastructure/backend person for most of my career. While I've worked with product folks and mobile folks and front-end folks, and they've been wonderful, that is just not where my expertise lies. So while I'm saying this is how an organization can make a decision about what to do and can all get on the same page, I can't really say intelligent things about how to work with product managers or designers or what kind of scaffolding or frameworks or process you would want to put around that. But can we agree, you know, wherever in the stack we are, that we all want to make, we have some things in common, like we all want to make good and useful things that people want to use. Let's agree on that. We've got this in common, no matter where we are in the stack. Okay, so my job is a bit weird because I was hired as the first principal engineer, and I had to figure out what that meant. And so now I've been doing this job for 20 months, and I've come to the conclusion that whatever I ended up doing on any given day was probably my job. So that's working out pretty well. But when I joined first, the guidance I got was solve big cross-team problems. And this is actually really great. Like, can you imagine a better job description than that? I love solving big cross-team problems. So my first week in the job, I was getting to know people, I was learning the systems, and I'm looking around for problems to solve. And after a few days, I had this meeting with my colleague, Trish. So Trish is one of those people who can look at a situation, right, and know what needs to change or what's not working to make it perfect. Like she can just see it. She's a TPM, a technical program manager, so she starts out like 15% more competent than anyone else anyway. But even more than that, she just has this incredible power to see what you can tweak to make everything wildly successful. At this point, I didn't even know that, but cool, someone put a 1-on-1 on my calendar, so I went. And we talked about a bunch of things. And one of the things was that Trish asked, if you're looking for problems to solve, can you do something about RFCs? And I said, maybe, what's wrong with RFCs? And Trish said, well, infrastructure engineering at Squarespace was a small group until relatively recently. The way a small group makes decisions is that, everyone talks to each other. Everyone who needs to know something probably has had lunch together. Information flows. It's really easy. But we've grown a lot, and we recently split infrastructure into a bunch of teams. And so we can't really easily all be in the same discussion anymore. So here's our current RFC process. Someone writes an RFC, a request for comment doc. They share the doc directly with some people, and then they also create a Jira ticket for it in the RFC project in Jira. Now, a lot of people have configured Jira so that whenever there's something new in that project, it'll send them an email about it. So a fairly arbitrary bunch of people will get an email about your new RFC. And the ones of them who have time and who find the subject line interesting will go read the document. So it's not really the set of reviewers you would have chosen. It's just whoever happens to be available. And then they all jump on the doc and beat the crap out of it. To be fair, you requested comments, you're going to get comments. Some of them are useful comments. Some of them are nitpicks. Some of them are spelling corrections. Some of them rip the core of your idea to pieces in front of your eyes. Some of them obsess about things that you consider out of scope. Some of them tell you you're solving the wrong problem, and some of them tell you you're solving the right problem, but in the wrong way. And there's just this general feeling of being beaten up. Then the reviewers go back to their regular lives and never think about your document again. So now you, the author, have a bunch of comment threads. Everyone typing the great American novel into this little 10-pixel wide comment sidebar on Google Docs. And then you go through all of these comments, and you probably accept the spelling corrections because that's easy. Even if you disagree, it's an S, not a Z. I'm from Ireland. You deal with the easier nitpicks, and then you're left with the big, difficult comments. Like, someone wants to know how the thing you want to do will integrate with a technology you've never heard of. And you're like, do I need to care about this? And you go read Wikipedia and try to get a feeling for, how important this thing is. Or someone else says, don't do this. Instead, use this other system that we're working on, and it'll be ready in a quarter. And you're like, how much do you trust them that it'll be ready in a quarter? But even worse than the comments are the lack of comments. What do you do about comments you don't get? Like, you see someone whose opinion you would care about has opened the doc, because you can see the little circle in the corner with their initial in it. And sometimes maybe you even see them highlighting something, like they're about to leave a comment, and then nothing. And then a couple of days later, they're gone. Was it just they opened it in one of their 700 tabs, and then later their browser crashed? You have no idea. There is no way of knowing. In the end, the author has a decision to make. So, should they implement the thing? Like, what do you do? Well, in the end, it kind of depends on how confident they feel in the idea. Maybe they just go with their gut. Maybe they do what they would have done if they hadn't sent the RFC for review in the first place. So this means we have really good ideas that never get implemented because the RFC authors don't know that they have support. Like, a lot of people leave comments, and then in the end, nobody has said, yeah, go ahead and do it. Lots of people can say no. Nobody's job is to say yes. But there's more than that, because even if you do decide to do it, there are more problems. Like, say you do start building it. When you're some of the way in, you may get to a point where someone tells you they missed the initial RFC and they're really surprised. And it turns out that's someone you were depending on to do part of the project. And they don't have time to do whatever it was you needed them to do. And so that part of your system is not going to be available for a quarter. Okay. Or a different team is mad because you're making a change that will break their workflow, and they love their workflow. And also, they think you're changing something that they don't really believe you understand. Or senior people come along and see the design for the first time after it's already implemented and say, I wish you'd shown us this earlier. There's a security risk or a fatal flaw, or I just philosophically hate this. You cannot launch this. Anyway, said Trish, can you work on that? I'm like, okay, to recap, so we have the big risks and design flaws that are discovered too late. We've got authors being overwhelmed with comments and not knowing which ones they have to give priority to. And some of them are nitpicks and some of them are essays. At the end of this, we still don't know if the right people have seen the document. And at the end, no one really gives guidance on whether to do the thing. Trish is like, yes. Do you want to do something about that? And I'm like, definitely. This sounds like exactly the sort of bike shed I should get involved in my first week in a new company. And now it's 20 months later. I have to tell you that one person who reviewed this slide deck, their only comment was to suggest a better picture of a bike shed. I swear this happened. It's like the best thing that has ever happened in my life. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 steps we took at Squarespace infrastructure to try to fix some of these problems. We built an opinionated RFC template. We set up this regular group meeting called Infrastructure Council, and then we set up a much smaller meeting called Architecture Review. And we did those one at a time, and each of them was on its own not perfect. It solved some problems, caused some new problems, and then we iterated and we went again. And at the end of this, spoiler, it's still not perfect. I like where we are so far, but we're still on this journey. Okay, so I wanted to start with that first problem, the fatal flaws and the dependency problems and the objections that are not being discovered until at the end, like after the thing is implemented. And I think a lot of this comes out of people not asking good questions at the start when they're reviewing. You know, if the reviewer, when they had been reviewing the RFC, had said, hey, it seems like this part of the project needs this other team to do something, have you asked them? That problem would have been avoided, right? But I don't know, it's kind of hard to ask questions. When you have something for review, it's really easy to do spelling corrections and it's really easy to nitpick. But it's much harder to say, how much do you know what you're doing here? You know, it's kind of embarrassing. And it can be hard to ask the obvious questions, like the stuff that you think the author must have thought about but just happened not to mention. Like, say I'm writing some new service that has a bunch of important data, and I'm putting it out on the internet. If you're reviewing that, you might think, you had your security team review that, right? Like, they should look at this, they should make sure this is cool. But also, it's such an obvious question that you might think that if you ask, I'll be really mad and indignant, and I'll judge you for even asking me. I wouldn't, by the way, I would say thank you for asking. But a lot of the time, questions can feel really obvious. Like, you said you're going to do lots of DNS lookups. Have you told whoever's running the name server that you're going to send them 10 times their current traffic? Like, you must have done that, right? You wouldn't have just decided to do this without writing, you just didn't write it down? It can be hard to ask the question. Or like, you've decided you're going to start using this kind of database that you heard about at a conference. Do you expect the databases team to run that for you, or were you planning to run it yourself? Like, this is a conversation that should happen pretty early on in the relationship of a new database is coming to your company. So it feels rude to ask these questions, but if you don't ask them, you're setting up for trouble later. So the first thing was to set up an RFC template that asked all the obvious rude questions for us. So like, we don't have to push through the discomfort of this weird social situation, you know, to review. Okay, so let's be clear. This is not an original idea in any way. Squarespace already had RFC templates, and Google has this great design doc template called Blue Doc, which I think has been rewritten from memory at every company where someone is that used to work at Google. I believe Etsy has entirely coincidentally got an orange doc, which I think is an amazing, amazing coincidence. Anyway, I updated our RFC templates to make sure they included really specific questions, like, what problem are you trying to solve? What problems are you not trying to solve? What are the non-goals? What's out of scope? What existing internal and external systems will you depend on? And do the people who run those systems know you're coming, and do they know your scale? And it asks this in a, you know, it's a document is asking. If a robot asks you a question, you can't be offended. What other approaches did you consider? What existing solutions were close, but they weren't quite right, but maybe they were quite right, but it was a really fun project and you wanted to write the code? What did you not use? What would it take to replace or integrate that into the thing you're making instead, so there ends up being only one thing? Are you adding new regular human processes or extra work for any teams? Like if you've got a customer support team, are they going to have to do something new? Is there training someone is going to need? Oh, and if it's a new system, who's going to run it? Important. And then what security or privacy or compliance aspects are you thinking about? And the template says, if you're not sure, assume there are some. Go talk to security. Here's how you get in touch with security. And then what risks can you think of that might make this not work? Don't do the thing where you hope nobody notices the risky part of your design. Spell them out. And we have a whole list of examples to spark ideas: complexity, compatibility, latency, service immaturity, lack of team expertise, other work taking priority, and so on. And then, of course, there's lots of space to talk about what you're actually planning to do and the context it's all in and what the design is. And it encourages people to draw diagrams because pictures are better than non-pictures. There are some things that I will say, you know, this is kind of, you can debate this, pictures and design documents. I will argue this forever. Okay, if you do, RFCs, if you do all of that, you are shaking out the answers to a lot of questions up front. All the people who need to interact with the system in the future will know what they're getting, and so their lives get better. But if you're writing the RFC, this will make your life easier as well, because this lets you become your own first reviewer. You get to look at what you're doing yourself through this checklist of things that you should be thinking about as you're designing. So, okay, that helps with design flaws. But what about all of those comments and then deciding which ones you have to care about? Like, if one person hates the design, but they weren't, you know, someone whose opinion you necessarily would have gone to, does that matter? So in the end, can you build a thing? So we added an approvers section. And the approvers section explicitly lists the people whose opinions you care about. You can care about other people. It's fine to care about lots of people's opinions, but these are the ones who, once they say yes, you're going to start implementing. It's really unambiguous. It gives a little extra work for the approver, because now, as they're going through the document, leaving their comments and spelling corrections and telling you about a thing they once thought of and like a whale and the whole thing, they have to come back here and at the end type yes into this little box. Or very occasionally no, sometimes not yet, and very often yes if, like yes if you've also gotten sign-off from security team, or yes if you make sure to handle this edge case that I left a comment about. If one of your approvers doesn't do this, then you don't get to assume, it's not implied approval. You get to go chase them down and ask them to type words into the box. So that added a lot of clarity. The RFC authors said in advance whose comments they had planned to care about, and they got an explicit yes. But we didn't have a good way of making sure the people they cared about were all the right people. Like, we still had projects being implemented without domain experts knowing about the project until after it was implemented, or a team running a dependency still being surprised by new traffic. So we wanted to make sure that when people were nominating the reviewers, they would also include like the other people who really needed to care. Like, if you're going to do something weird with databases, you should tell your databases team before the things in production. So we needed a forum to advertise RFCs and let people ask questions about them. And so the next idea was to add this regular meeting, and this is Infrastructure Council. Okay, why is it called Infrastructure Council? Well, it was for infrastructure, that much is easy. And then our friends in product engineering already had this meeting called Product Backend Council, and that seemed really good, so I copied it. And this talk is basically the story of me copying other people's good ideas, and I am cool with that. So the Product Backend Council had some cool features that I really liked. Somebody who wanted their RFC reviewed would ask to get on the agenda, and then the Product Backend Council moderator would send an email saying, here's what's on the agenda, and people who were interested would come, and actually most of the org would go. And then the RFC author would kind of read the RFC to the room, which wasn't great, but then people would talk about it in depth, and there would be a good discussion, and people would ask questions about stuff they didn't get, and in the end, everyone would walk away knowing that this thing was going on. And then if they had more questions, they would go and read about it. So I really liked that. There was a neat side effect where people were talking who don't always talk. People were presenting. People were seeing people talking who they didn't see every day. So it was a good way of making connections. And I like that too. So I also added our own little flair to it. We started every meeting. Click. No. Clicker again. Sorry. Thank you. We started every meeting by asking, is anyone new? Like, who's just joined us? Let's celebrate them. did anything cool happen this week? And what's on the radar? Like, is anything coming up that everyone should know about? So I sent this email out telling everyone, that, spoiler, I sent this email out telling everybody that, this is going to happen. And I was actually pretty nervous about it. Because for all that I'm like, oh yeah, I totally know what I'm doing all the time, I had never had the hubris to invite an entire organization to a meeting before. Like, that's really expensive. I'd been at the company for 2 months. I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing this. I think I actually, that's my boss, Frank, in the corner. I think I actually might have actually gotten him, put it in his calendar, not coming from my calendar. I didn't know if people would come. I didn't know if the agenda would be interesting to anybody but me. But we did it, and it was great. It was so good. Tons of people came. We were standing room only, and something happened that I hadn't really thought about, which is that after anybody presented or did something, everybody applauded, which, I don't know, is a kind of a normal thing, but it was nice. And then people laughed at each other's jokes and kind of laughed together in a room. And it was sort of warm and good. And at the end, I said something like, okay, we're going to do this every 2 weeks, so, if you have something to present, come talk to me. And then everyone applauded that. And then they laughed because it was sort of silly to have applauded that. And it was so nice. And then on the way out of the room, I ran into Trish, and she told me, you may have gotten the impression that Trish is someone whose opinion matters to me, and she told me she had loved InfoCouncil. And I was like, I have solved all the problems. Trish was right to trust me with this really important mission. But don't worry, this feeling did not last, because over time, some new problems became clear. Like, people were scared to present. It turns out, this will shock you, if you have an idea, even if you think it's maybe a great idea, it's very scary to go in front of your whole organization and ask them what they think about it. Like, people were right to be scared, it turned out, because sometimes the review was absolutely brutal. Like, it's bad enough when someone leaves a comment on your design document to tell you that you're full of crap. It is much worse when you do this presentation and the very first comment is someone saying, I have grave concerns, Have you really thought this through? Do you know what you're doing? And they're not just saying it to you, they're saying it to you and your manager and your director and like the interns on your team. And everybody you've ever met, it feels like at that moment, is watching you get told you don't know what you're talking about. It was horrible. And they weren't even always good questions. Like, they were all the nitpicks and vague questions and like essays that we'd had in RFCs. No spelling corrections, but I'm sure if people could have figured out how. So once again, you had the ambiguity of not knowing how much you needed to care. And this was from someone who wasn't an approver. If they were the person asking you a question, like, what did that mean? What did that mean? Did you have to care about it? So although we still had this really good community vibe, we were finding that people didn't really want to present, or especially junior people didn't want to present. Or if they did, they waited until the end, until the RFC was really polished, and the prototype was really polished, and arguably it was running in production, but sure, we definitely want a review. And any changes at that point would have been really difficult and expensive and unwelcome. So the review came in too late, of course, and all the design flaws and the risks weren't noticed until we were in production again. Anyway, with 3 presentations in a 1-hour meeting, each RFC was getting about 15 minutes of review, using some time for wins and so on. And so that just wasn't enough time to introduce the idea and go deep on it. So okay, this helped. This was something, but it wasn't enough. So we tried again. If we had any hope of people wanting to come, and wanting to come early to talk about their RFCs, we needed a smaller group than InfoCouncil. And this brought us to architecture review, which also, I did not invent this idea. I'm fairly sure I stole it from Gordon Radlin. The idea of architecture review was that we would have 5 people, and they would always be the same 5 people. And they would review every major RFC for the entire organization. When I mentioned this to the 5 people first, they were like, you want us to do what? But they bought in. We started with me, 3 staff engineers from infrastructure, and 1 staff engineer from product engineering to keep us calibrated and honest. And I picked people who I thought would have a lot of opinions and also who covered a lot of areas of technology. So we'd have a good amount of review power in the room. And 5 people, that's not super scary, right? So the author would still write an RFC, and they would still list their approvers, and they would still send it to get approved. And then once it was approved by their people, then they would take it to architecture review for like final support. And the idea was, because we would always have the same 5 people there, that they'd build up a picture of everything that was happening. And they'd notice like conflicting initiatives and things that didn't quite work together. And we would all, as well, to use the time well, we would all commit to turning up, having already read the RFC and left comments on it. So this was a pretty big time commitment, but it was good. And then we would spend the whole hour just discussing it, not reading it. Except the last 10 minutes, we would go around the room and everybody would explicitly say yes, or yes if, or not yet, or very occasionally no. And then we would write really detailed notes, and in the notes we would include these yeses. So it would say, this person's name, yes, and so on. And so the person who brought the RFC would leave the room with the documented support of a bunch of senior people, which is kind of nice. And it worked pretty well. Except people immediately started to act like we were a creepy, shadowy group judging from behind closed doors in like a smoky room. And we didn't want that. Like, we didn't want to invite the whole org, but we also didn't want to be creepy. So we wanted to bring some more people in. And also, you know, it turns out that 5 people can't cover all of the knowledge in the universe. This will shock you. We wanted some experts for other domains when we needed them. So now what we do is we invite a few subject matter experts for every review. So if you're coming to talk about, I don't know, if you're coming to talk about databases, we will bring in an expert from the databases team. Or maybe we'll bring in a key user of the system you're designing, or someone who's going to run one of your dependencies, or just somebody who you think will have a good perspective because they've done something similar before. Since these people rotate in and out, it makes the room not feel creepy and secret. And we take really detailed notes, and those are all public. And then we go to every infrastructure council, and we say, here's what's coming up in the next architecture review, and here's what happened in the previous architecture review, or possibly several architecture reviews. And I think this has genuinely gone well. I've been asking people about how it's going and collecting feedback, and they said they found it useful for thinking through all of the details, that they liked the comments from reviewers. One person said it had made them a better engineer, which I really liked, and that they liked being able to see their design in the big context, because it's easy to get into your own area of technology. Also, I got the best testimonial I've ever had for anything I've done, which is, it actually wasn't that scary. It's like, I was pleased about that. Okay, so where that leaves Infrastructure Council is that we've put away the weapons, and we've leaned more into the applauding good work and, you know, giving people kudos and saying what's going well and having this kind of community feeling. It's become this place where you present the work at the end. You can do it, either take the RFC after it's gone through architecture review and you're pretty sure you're going to do it, or you can wait till the end after implementation. It's like 50% informational, 50% bragging. It's kind of nice. It would be considered really bad form now to ask a mean question at Infrastructure Council. Like, you can ask softball questions, which again, I encourage you to do later, but mean questions would not be okay. And we use it for things like little miniature tech talks, and for presenting what we want to do, and for, you know, telling a story about how we did a thing, or for, if someone writes a really good retrospective or postmortem, we ask them to come present it because everyone can learn from it, things like that. I love Infrastructure Council. It makes me really happy. And Product Backend Council has recently changed to use our model of doing the reviews in architecture review, but using a community meeting for Product Backend. So, like, we did steal their idea, but they stole ours right back, so this is good. Synergies or something. Okay, so you might think that I'm now like, aha, I have solved all of the problems again. But no, because we have a ways to go. The RFC template we used, for example, was pretty big, and it ended up being too intimidating for some use cases. And we got feedback from some of the other organizations that it didn't really fit their needs, and they wanted maybe a different template. So a bunch of us got together from across all of engineering and rewrote the template so that everybody felt like it would be useful for them. And it's also a little less scary. But we're waiting to see, that was a few weeks ago, and we're waiting to see how that plays out. And we'll probably change it again. Folks in product engineering and internal engineering are doing architecture reviews, which is great, but the load on some of the reviewers is getting really heavy because there are just some people in the company you want in every review, and we have to figure out what to do about that. We're splitting it into multiple core groups, so we've got 5 people for infrastructure, but also 5 people for each of other groups, but we're not sure yet if that's going to be the right way to do it, and we're going to see where that goes, and we're going to keep iterating. We need some sort of story for follow-up. Like if you say you're going to do something, you take it to architecture review, people say, yes, we support this idea, and then later you find a flaw with it and you're going to do something else. Should you come back to architecture review again? Like, I think the answer is probably sometimes yes, sometimes no, but we want to give some better guidelines on that than, which is what we have not written down, but you know, that's where we are right now. TBD. And also we don't have a great story for rotating people in and out for our architecture reviews. It's mostly been staff engineers so far, but this feels like a really good way to give senior engineers an opportunity to prove that they're staff engineers and to have access to this kind of work. So maybe we should be rotating through senior engineers and giving them an opportunity to become staff engineers. So for all that I think we've made good progress, we're still iterating. And we'll probably always be iterating. And I think that's really good. Because the point of all of this is to make something good and useful that people want to use. Like if you're doing RFCs or you're doing reviews or you're doing any kind of process, it should be helping people. It should be helping them move faster over the long term. It slows you down in the short term, but in the long term, it stops you from getting paged at 2 a.m. or it stops you from having a problem that pushes your design back by a quarter. It should make it easier to build consensus. If it ends up feeling like it's gatekeeping or it's red tape or it's bureaucracy or it's really scary or for whatever reason it's not solving your problem, then you go find out why and you iterate and you go again. So in conclusion, if you're trying to solve a problem, I recommend that you be prepared to try things out and iterate and iterate and iterate because process is only useful if it's actually useful. I know, this is the kind of profound observation you come to Code as Craft for, right? Okay, I will leave you with a slide from my 6-year-old who asked me what this talk was about, and she asked to make a slide. She wants you to know that if you keep trying to make things better, you will feel happier at the end. And then she got really serious and intense, and she said, tell everyone to write good code. So please write good code. And that is all I have. Thank you very much. Wow. All right.
Okay. I think that's for me.
That one's for you.
That's for me. Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you so much, Tanya. That was, I feel like
Grab my
I
glass of water.
have, okay. I feel like I have a whole bunch of notes now that I'm going to be sharing with our architecture review working group about stuff that we can do to improve our documents and our processes. So thank you. That was excellent. So my first softball question for you is, I love the name of your personal website, noidea.dog. Can you please tell me where that came from?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so you know that meme? Do you know the meme? No Idea
It's like
Dog?
my favorite meme.
This is my favorite meme. If you don't know it, it's a dog. I think it's like, I don't know, a Labrador or a setter or something.
Yeah, golden retriever.
Golden retriever. It's like a big dog wearing this like chemistry glasses. I don't know. Chemistry glasses is not a thing. You know, like protective eyewear for doing science in. I'm losing nouns. It's been a day. Like with beakers and things. Yeah. So it's a dog doing science, and it's really the dog is really into this process. Who knows with the dog? But underneath it just says, "I have no idea what I'm doing." And I used to have this printed out over my monitor because I try to give away my job every 18 months. This is how I work. I try to move and do some new kind of project, or I don't mean I change roles or change companies, but I try to work on something new every 18 months. So I always have no idea what I'm doing, and it's cool. Like you got to keep learning. And I find this dog so inspirational that this. It's just there. Like, okay, we're doing chemistry. Yeah, there you go.
Fantastic. That I'm very glad, because I thought it was that dog, because I too love that meme. I have used it in presentations when I talk about Git.
When I went to when .dog dropped, you know, the .dog TLD, and I went to there and it was available. I was like, this is the best day of my life. I couldn't believe it.
Nice.
I have simple needs. I don't know.
Awesome. So a question that I have, so at Etsy we have a fairly mature, we've been doing our architecture review working group, we call it. So I think you definitely did steal the idea from Gordon, who got it from Etsy. And you know, we've had a fairly mature set of processes, but in the last year, we've started to think about how we can change the process, because we've ended up in that same situation that you did, where people started to look on it as like the secret cabal of very, very important staff engineers who only are available to give their opinions on big, far-reaching systemic problems, which meant that folks were super intimidated. They weren't surfacing things. We didn't have enough transparency. So we switched and added into our normal rotation of workshops and open all of engineering architecture reviews, this idea of office hours, where folks can come. It's a small group. It's basically just everyone on the architecture review working. I'm just going to say ARWG, because when I try to say it out, I mess it up. But everybody on the ARWG is there, and you can just come and talk about your idea. And so we've found that with that, opening it up, and it's sort of taking away the mystique, taking away a lot of the formality, and it's really increased the engagement that we're seeing. So I wonder, do you see this? There seems like there's this tension between formality, secrecy, size of the meeting, who's in the meeting, and the participation of engineers. And I'm really interested to know, like, where have you fallen in that spectrum, or do you think, you know, having the multiple meetings is the way to address that? What do you think?
So we've set up this sort of parallel meeting called Architecture Exploration to go with review, because sometimes review, it's after you've written the doc, even then it's sometimes too late for review. It's like you really would have liked to have had opinions a month ago. So we set up this exploration group where it's mostly the same people, but it's mostly the same people in the same room taking the same kind of notes. It's odd, but it's got a different name, so people are much more comfortable. And there's either a whiteboard or a whiteboarding feel, if you know what I mean, even if you're not actually using a whiteboard. And a bunch of people get into a room together, and well, whoever wants to do something, we've got a channel for it, a Slack channel for Arc Exploration, and they come into the channel and they say, I was thinking of doing something about blurb, blurb, blurb. Who is interested in talking about that? And then like maybe 6 or 8 people get into a room with them and they go figure it out. So they have that kind of access. I mean, I guess it's the same as office hours. We have set times on calendar just because scheduling is awful.
Yeah.
It's like the hardest problem remaining in computer science is getting people's calendars to line up.
Yes.
The formality, a lot of people have told us going in that they were scared and coming out that they weren't. So I'm hoping we can, if anyone from Squarespace is listening, hello, there's some people here, I hope it's not scary. We're really trying hard to make it feel open.
Yeah. We're nice. We don't bite.
Right.
Come talk to us.
And it should be, you do want people to ask hard questions, not here, in architecture reviews. But you want them to ask them nice, you know? So, yeah.
Cool. That actually leads me quite nicely into the next question I had for you, which is, with this process, how have folks been deciding what is RFC worthy? Like, do you have guidelines? Is it sort of a cultural norm? You know, I think that's something that we hear a lot, especially from our product engineers, is, well, I don't know if my change is worthy of actually going through this whole process. It doesn't touch other systems. It maybe doesn't, you know, affect another team. Like, how do you approach kind of deciding what's RFC worthy?
Right. Well, we've been saying what's start at architecture review. What's architecture review worthy is anything that is a change to how we're doing things, like a big change of direction, it's like something new, or will affect other teams, which is, it turns out, very many things. For writing an RFC, we don't have great guidelines on that, except that when anyone asks me, I always say, write them for everything. Yeah. Like I write them for stuff that only I will need to do. And I mean, I'm not saying I write them very thoroughly. I use the template, but I leave out the sections I don't think matter, which I think is the right thing to do in general. But I try to use it as something for myself to clarify where I'm going. Yeah. And even if you decide when you finish it, you're going to show it to a bunch of other people, even if it was just your own work, kind of, it keeps you a bit more honest, you know? When you notice stuff like you're writing something in the passive tense, passive voice, where you say, this will happen, and you're like, someone's going to call me on this. Okay, this is who I think will do this, you know? I mean, I would be really interested to hear other people's takes on that. Like, when do you think you write RFCs?
Yeah, so Gordon, we keep talking about Gordon. Gordon is our director, and he brought the Orange Doc concept from Google to Etsy, and in our org, I know, we have started using Orange Docs internally. It's something actually that's a little separate from the more specific like architecture review working group process. But I found that it's just a really useful framework for thinking about all different levels of changes. Just because the questions that it poses about thinking about, okay, you know, what is my actual goal here? What are the possible touch points with other teams? You know, things like security always happens, and nobody ever thinks to reach out to security. You know, so I feel like it's, as a whole, the kind of that framework of how to think about a change is something that's really useful at multiple levels. And if there's a section in the doc that doesn't apply, then you just delete it and just don't worry about it anymore. Yeah. So I've become a convert to the Orange Doc format, and I think through the architecture review, like the more formalized process, I was taking notes about, I really like how you have suggestions of different kinds of risks. I think, you know, it can be really hard when you're sitting there and you're filling out this document to really stop and think about what the risks could be, particularly because you're so focused on what you're trying to accomplish, and you might not see that. So I think having more prompts to help people get their like creative juices flowing.
I think a doc like this is really good for like a kind of a culture change nudge as well. Like I always think about what are the levers we have. Like if we want someone to do something, you can ask them to do it, and then they might or they might not or they might forget. But if you want, I don't know, hundreds of people to do something, what's the efficient way to do that? And if everyone is using a template, and the template says always talk to security, here's how to talk to security, like click here to talk to security. It's like it's just a place where it's easy. Totally. Like we added to ours recently when we did our like all engineering, a group of people in a room rewriting our template. The mobile people asked us to call out in the like who are your dependencies or who are your stakeholders. We've got a note saying don't forget mobile. I'm sorry, mobile. I guess we were forgetting them a lot. But it's like when you're changing something, go ask them how it will affect them. Totally. So stuff like that. It can be a good reminder.
So speaking of culture, one of the things that I find really interesting is, so Etsy is very much a consensus-driven and consensus-based culture. And the fact that you have an explicit place for people to say yes or no is kind of like, whoa. Can we do that? Are we allowed to do that? Is that okay, Mike? Can we? No. Do you find, was that something that was already kind of a part of the culture? Have people reacted well to having to get explicit approval, maybe getting a no, or are you finding that people kind of chafe at that? What do you think?
So I've been saying all along for this, you know, we're a sign, not a cop, you know. We can say no and you can do it anyway. You can always make the decision to go ahead with a design after the senior people in your organization have said, we don't think this is a good idea. And like, sometimes maybe that's the right thing to do, if you really, really believe. So we can't stop you, you know, we're not gonna take your keyboard away. People have, well, I got like 6 things I want to say on this. We've been doing in architecture review. Did you read recently the IETF? I think wrote about rough consensus. It was this great article that went around where they talked about how they make decisions based on not everyone has to say yes, but it has to be a big majority says yes. And they had this whole thing about people humming to give the sense of the room, and like we don't do that. Though I think that would be kind of cool. So we have had architecture reviews where it's like yes, 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 no. And then we try to unpack the no in the room. We don't just say no. We say like, okay, what don't you like? Can we turn this into a yes? And sometimes when you unpack the no, it's like, no, I don't think you should do this because this one edge case will be a problem. And it's like, okay, well, what if they say this, but also they'll handle this edge case, or this, but they promise not to do this one thing? And it's like, oh, well, that's a yes.
Yeah, well, I think the really nice thing about it is, like you said, you can kind of end up in comment hell, where you don't know what are the right comments to reply to and what's important, and are they saying yes, are they saying no? So I do like having the explicit place to say, okay, I say yes, I say no, and then you can have that conversation versus being like, there's like a million threads. Yeah, so
right. And there's so many
you totally captured the like feeling of Google Doc comment hell.
Yeah, it's the worst.
It is.
Yeah.
So something that I think you mentioned at the very end that I'm super interested in is, again, I mentioned, I think one of the things we've been working to change about our architecture review process is to make sure that product engineers feel more included in the process, because it did have an aura or a mystique about it of this is only for systems or infrastructure engineers. And some of the things we've done is we've instituted rotations, we've brought in more subject matter experts, but it sounds like at Squarespace you've still kind of held on to this distinction between there's a group you go to for product and then there's a group you go to for infra. How do you feel? Do you think, is that the right distinction? Are there a lot of cases where things are kind of blurry and crossing the two lines? Like, is that something you think will continue?
Right. I think some things are fairly firmly on one or the other side of the line. And by that, I mean, you should have at least one person from outside your organization there. But it's fine to make it a fairly local decision. But we've also had architecture reviews which are like hybrid. We've only been doing the multiple groups for a little while, but we've been doing, who are the people you would like to say yes to this? Sometimes it's not even the core group. That idea of having 5 people who would know everything, it turns out that doesn't scale. Isn't that shocking?
This is my shocked face.
Yeah. So there are some people who go to all of them. But yeah, we've got a lot of things that are like, okay, we need a couple of people from the other org to be here to kind of, the people you can't make a decision without in some cases. Like, we're going to do this, and then this room says yes, and then this person over here says no, you're not, and the room is like, oh, okay, our mistake. Cool, So that didn't answer your question in any way.
No, but I think it did.
I don't know.
I think you're right. I mean, I think I think this is a tension that we constantly feel in our engineering org as a whole, is that we have so many different types of engineers who all report up together into one giant blob called engineering. And, the things that we're working on, like, sometimes they touch each other, sometimes it's important to know, other times it just goes right over your head. So it's really, it's very difficult, I think, to find the right balance between getting the information and the questions to the right people versus wasting people's time.
Right.
When our subject matter expertises are so vastly different, like, you're the front end. I mean, I'm the front end, you're the back end, so I'm sure we don't have very much to talk about.
Ever.
I'm just kidding. Clearly we have a lot to talk about.
We have in product engineering a few people who are really championing architecture review, who are and who have shown the value of it by, like the reason infrastructure was, it landed well with infrastructure was that the comments people were getting in architecture review were actually useful. Or at least some of them were, I hope. And so now that product engineering is doing this as well, they've got some people who are showing up and asking really good questions and catching problems that would have happened if that hadn't happened. So I think that's going a long way towards showing the value of the idea. Why do you think this comes out of infrastructure? What's that about?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think Etsy historically was a very infrastructure focused company, and so I think that's probably where it came. You know, we had a lot of engineering leadership who came from the infrastructure world, and I think a lot of these practices sort of end up starting there and have spread, and now you know, with the product engineers coming on board, they're like, oh, this is really cool and I want to do this, but they're also super intimidated by it, or they feel like they're not worthy. So we're working pretty hard to try to change that and make it more open and have everyone understand that, hey, you know, coming and talking to us at our office hours isn't a waste of our time.
Writing stuff down is really good too.
Yeah, writing stuff down is great. So one final question I have. So have you ever had to deal with like a stalemate where maybe there's two different equally valid ways that you could be approaching something, and you know, I don't know if it's on the team level or if it's at the council level, where people are just not backing down and you kind of have this stalemate of, well, we could do X or we could do Y, and both are equally valid. Like, have you had something like that come up, and how have you handled that?
So I like moderating meetings where I don't care about the outcome, where I just care that there is an outcome. I think that's really fun. So if you go in like knowing that there's this faction and there's this faction, and they want different things, or at least they think they want different things, and you don't care really what the outcome is going to be, but you need there to be a decision. Otherwise, we can't move on. Yeah. We'll still be sitting in this room a year from now. It's going to suck. I find that really fun. So,
do you think, is that something that the architecture group or the council could or should be getting more involved in, other than just you personally enjoying it?
I guess I feel like any senior person, that's a skill we should build, of getting a technical decision out of an ambiguous mess or out of a conflict. Because most of the time when this happens, people agree on like 80%. And they're like, no, this, well, no, this. And it's like, then when you ask, it's like, okay, you all agree on this much, so let's write that down. And then in the end, it's usually something pretty small. Yeah. So I feel like that ability to look at two conflicting points of view and find the pre-consensus, I guess, is in there, is a skill that everyone at Architecture Review I would want to be working on that or good at it already. I don't know if that's it. I don't know if like a group like that is good for actually making that decision, because you kind of, if you've already got a bunch of people who are arguing, well, I don't know. I'm going to talk myself out of this now. Like maybe it is good to go in front of a group and say, what does everybody think? But then
I think it's because, like you said, when you're not directly emotionally invested in the outcome, it's much easier for you to ask questions and to sort of see the forest for the trees of like, well, you say that, you know, one of your goals is to increase developer productivity, but if we go with solution X, it means that developers are going to have to do all this manual work. And so, you know, this actually isn't solving your problem. But
then you have the risk that half of the architecture review will take each side, and then you've got an even bigger dance off, you know.
Awesome. All right, so that's it for my questions that I have. So maybe now we'll take some questions from the audience. There's a microphone on a stand right there. Don't all get up and rush at once. Cool. Oh, someone's walking over.
Terrifying to go first. Thank you. That was fantastic. One of the things that I thought was most interesting was when you mentioned the potential for this process to help make the difference in what makes someone who's a senior engineer be able to move up to and get that perspective to become a staff engineer or a principal engineer. I'm curious, I work on WordPress, very large global open source project where the next major contributor to the project is not a senior engineer. They may be someone we've never heard of that happens to be privileged enough to have the free time to participate that we've never known about before. So in that context, there's two questions I would have. One, do you have any suggestions about how you can make the process of participating in an RFC more appealing to juniors in your case and people that are just stepping into open source for the first time in mine? And do you have any input or things you've found have been useful to hold in your head as a principal or a staff engineer or a senior engineer to make bringing in those new viewpoints more welcoming and more appealing?
When you're saying RFC, do you mean people leaving comments on documents?
In this case, yes. We've introduced an RFC process as part of the new editor that we created a year ago, actually to go after Squarespace's market share. But
cool.
And so we do have a somewhat formalized RFC process. It's not well advertised, and we're having trouble figuring out how to encourage people to feel comfortable participating in it because it is governed by a very vocal minority.
I think you might have the governed by a very vocal minority. Maybe the problem. Are they nice vocal? Are they vocal like there's vocal like, hey, that person just said something really smart. Hey, everyone, listen to them. And there's vocal like, no, you're wrong.
They're very well-meaning. They are vocal because they are the people that are paid to work on the project, where that is a minority of the people that contribute to a large open source project.
I guess this is pretty situation dependent, but I guess making sure there's space for people, both making it feel safe to ask questions and to say dumb stuff. I say dumb stuff all the time, and when I do it, I kind of shine a light on how I just said dumb stuff. I try to be like you mentioned blameless postmortems earlier. I try to be really like, hey, I broke this thing, or hey, I didn't understand that, or hey, I just learned this. So I feel like there's a lot of value in everybody being vocal about learning and it being safe being wrong, and just like trying to make it feel safe. And then anytime anyone is even slightly mean, like 1% mean, 1% exclusionary, you go talk to them and explain why they should not ever do that again. And even like there's nothing that flies below the bar for this. Like if you really want new people to come in, you say, okay, that seemed really innocuous, but that's going to push away some people. So you got to be like extra charming and nice all the time, even when you don't feel it. So I don't know if like I feel like that would, if you're saying, we're trying to make this really welcoming for junior people and for new people, like to keep saying that and to keep saying like I don't know, come make mistakes. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think as a corollary to that, like you said, having senior folks model that behavior is so incredibly important. There was a tweet recently that I saw by Mountain Goats. I can't remember his real name. And it was like, please hire me, a senior engineer, and I will come to your meetings and ask, what is this? I don't understand it. Why did you do this? So like when you have, and then he went on to say, when you have the social capital of being a senior engineer, that one of the better way to spend it is to ask those kinds of questions, to be the one to say, I don't know, or I don't understand this, or can you explain this to me? And that's something that I generally try to model. I mean, I just naturally am like, oh, what?
I love the expression, explain it like I'm 5.
Yes.
Like, we're in the middle of an incident, we type ELI 5, like, I have no idea what's going on. Please explain this. Yeah.
Hi. So I guess I have another question about adoption, but in a different part of the pipeline. So I work here at Etsy, and I feel like I didn't use our architecture review process for the first year, and not because I didn't know what it was, but I came from a startup. We didn't have this thing. Everybody around me was the architecture working group all the time. So I guess I wonder, like, how do you market it to begin with? Like, how do you explain the value proposition to people? I'm an engineering manager as well. How do you get partners involved? Are you more like driven from the individual contributors? Like how does it get to the point where someone's like, yes, I understand the value and everybody's on board, the product managers are on board, and we can move forward and actually do this process?
Well, we're still in that journey. So initially, we marketed is a good word, I think. We marketed this as you want to do a thing and you don't know if you're allowed to do a thing. Come and we will give you we will say yes to this. I mean, we're a self-appointed group, but that's not the point. Somebody who's not you will have said, yes, you can do this. And that was pretty useful for making some big technology decisions we'd been sitting on. People were like, I want to make this decision, I want to make this call, but who can tell me yes? So that was the starting point. Like, we can tell you yes. No one says we can't, so I guess we can. We talked about it at our engineering all hands recently as like here is an opportunity to our director of business products, Natasha, gave me a really good framing on this. She said, over your career, you will work on some number of projects, and some number of them will succeed, and some number will fail. And if you're the only person looking at your work, that's the only experience you can bring to it. So why would you not take the opportunity to be in a room with everybody else's experience of what works and what will fail, which I found good.
Yeah. I like that.
What?
I don't know. I think there are plans in the works. I'm looking at Kier over here for us to sort of reintroduce the ARWG in the new year and sort of talk about some of the changes that we've been making. So if you work at Etsy, stay tuned. But we're trying to figure that out as well. Like, I think it's a especially when you have new people who come on board. I think that there's been things that were sort of like taken for granted as like, oh, this is a key core part of our culture at Etsy, but you have to constantly reinvent your culture as new people come in, and you have to recreate your culture, and you have to get new people to buy in. And the reasons why we did this in 2015, I think, was when we started, with our ARWG format. Those reasons don't exist anymore. So what are the new reasons? And so even if we did figure out how to market it now, we're going to have to figure out how to market it again and again and again and again and again, as long as we think it's a useful process.
I always think of like, what are the levers we have? If you want to change a culture, again, you can't just tell everybody. So you've got all hands, you've got emailing people, which that's not great. It can sometimes work. You've got if someone's following a process, then you put this as a step in the process. Like, where can you put this in front of people's eyes and make this be normal?
Hello. So my question is a little bit about how we talked about making things that are useful. And I'm curious if there's any sort of like ROI or cost benefit analysis that also is included in this process. And like, do you have a way of measuring developer smiles?
This is yours.
Oh gosh. I don't know the answer to that, because it's one of those hard things to measure, right? Like, how do you measure mistakes you didn't make? So I don't know the answer to that question.
I've been asking people as they come out the door of architecture review, I've been saying, how was that? Mm-hmm. But like saying it not like very publicly, but like, was that okay? And framing it like, we're trying to make this better. Can you tell me whether this was, you won't hurt my feelings if you say this completely sucked. 2 of them have completely sucked. And we've made changes based on that.
Yeah.
Sometimes people do surveys, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned it, that there's I think that's something that we are missing as well, is that follow-up piece of like going back after you've actually done the thing and saying, did it end up like you thought it would? Did the feedback help? Was the feedback useless? How did you feel about the process? So I think there's definitely a lot of room to grow with figuring out, okay, was this as successful as we think and we hope that it would be?
Yeah.
Good question. Thank you.
Hi, my question is, I'm wondering if you could comment on either in relation to your talk or just more generally, going up the ladder from senior software engineer to staff engineer or whatever the titles are, what's the distinctive contribution of each of those roles on the individual contributor track, not non-manager track, and distinctive benefit? Just going up as far as you can. I don't know what the top one is. Yeah.
I think it just keeps going forever. You become a being of light at the end. The benefit to you or the benefit to the org?
The org, yeah. So, a constructive thing that also you could use to kind of sell it if you wanted to create the role at your org or something like that. Yeah.
I have thousands of opinions on this. So would you like to go first?
Oh, sure. So to me, I think a lot of it, and I think at Etsy we sort of look at it as what is your impact and how autonomous are you? So, ideally as you're getting more and more and more senior, you're not executing other people's ideas, you're coming up with the ideas and then figuring out how to help other people execute on them together. And I think that kind of, once you get up into the staff engineer levels, there's a bit of an expectation that the kinds of problems that you're going to be servicing, fixing, working on are much bigger in their scope, or maybe they're much more complicated or intractable, and that a lot of that is going to come from you. It's not necessary, like Tanya, had this sort of really great idea passed on to her, and she took it and she ran with it, and but it was a very small prompt, right? It was what about RFCs? And then she went off and came up with this entire framework to think about why is this terrible and what are the problems and how are we going to attack each one of these individual problems and solve them, and then how are we going to roll this out to our entire organization and our entire company. And so, when you think about all of the moving parts and the scope of something like that, it's just massive. And to me, that's the kind of thing that an architect, a principal, a senior, a very senior staff person is going to be working on and thinking at that level.
Natasha, who I mentioned earlier, who is apparently a huge influence on me, has framed it as you move from building software to building an organization that builds software, which is, there's always this joke about 10x engineers, but you become a 10x engineer by making 10 people really good. That's the way you have that impact. So I think, I think when the shape of the job, senior and moving up the ladder, the shape of the job, I think, is similar. I think the job boils down to executing on projects that are, get bigger. At the start, they're maybe inside a team scope, and then they become cross teams and inside an organization scope, and then maybe they become across an entire company, and maybe they become across the entire industry. So the scope of the kinds of projects you're tackling get bigger. The amount you're expected to make everybody else better gets bigger. So as a senior engineer, you're expected to be a good influence in code review. As a staff engineer, maybe you're expected to write a style guide or to convince people to do code review who aren't currently doing code review. That's that sort of thing. So it's like, people have sometimes said it's a different job at every level, and I actually don't agree with that. I think it's a really similarly shaped job, but the scope of it gets much bigger.
What are the levels? Staff engineer and then?
Oh, it depends on which company you're at. They're different everywhere, but a lot of people use the Rent the Runway ladder, which is senior staff principal, which is also what Google uses, what Squarespace uses.
Yeah, we have pretty much that, but then we have this kind of side architect track, which I am on, which is a slightly different role within the regular career ladder, where it's more explicitly about strategy and coming up with problems and opportunities and figuring out how to solve them. So
cool.
So I think my role is very I think there's this weird dichotomy when you get more senior where you can be more senior by thinking about things across multiple teams and multiple organizations, or you can get more senior by thinking very deeply about your tech stack that your team is working on. And there's this weird dichotomy where we combine those two things into one IC ladder. But I think the kind of this architect thing that we've been exploring is like a acknowledgement that there's different ways to be more senior, and there's different levers that you pull or different skills that you bring to the table as you become more senior.
And strategy is another, like, a good example.
Yeah. Oh, I love strategy.
Yeah. If you're like, I feel like a junior engineer, they're expected to plan out their sprint, maybe. And then by the time you're senior, you should have a really good feeling for the quarter and maybe the year. And like, once you're more senior than that, you should be thinking about, where do we want to be in a year? Where do we want to be in 2 years? And how far you're expected to see.
Yeah. No, I don't think I could ever like go back to product engineering, because if somebody came to me and was like, Katie, can you build this feature for us? I would be like, here's a system to build that feature in the most like elegant, reusable, whatever way. You know, I would never be able to just like add code to add a feature ever again. That's not how my brain works, you know?
Yeah, it's like, could this whole process be more smooth? And they're like, no, please just write the code. And you're like, let me think.
I'm like, well, actually, if we did this other thing all together. Well, no, but I think that's another piece of it is like, to me, I think really good senior folks have the ability to look at like one problem and another problem and understand that there's actually a third problem underlying both of those, which is the ultimate cause for problems A and B. It's actually problem Z. And if we fix problem Z, it's going to fix A and B, because it's the foundational step that we need to fix these other problems. And I feel like, you know, people, the more senior you get, the more you're able to like suss out and understand those relationships that maybe a more junior person wouldn't necessarily see.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great question.
Hi, that was a really great talk. There was one point that both of you touched on that I was a little bit more curious about. So you both mentioned that you had like a set group of reviewers that was pretty small, and that worked well in many ways. But one thing that didn't work well was that people felt it was kind of like a gated community or like smoky room or something like that. So then you expanded the group so that for each maybe RFC or design that was coming forward, you would maybe invite different subject matter experts. So something I was curious about is like how did you figure out like the process for like which subject matter experts to invite for if it's different for different RFCs, and like sort of what is the process that you have and how do you end up with it, and are you happy with it? I was just kind of curious about that.
It's super ad hoc right now. So if you come with an RFC we've got a channel for architecture review, and you drop in there, you say, I'd like an architecture review, and then someone there will say, who do you think should be there? And then a lot of it is like somebody else will say, oh yeah, if you're talking about authentication, make sure you have this person who's an expert on authentication there. So we don't have, we've talked occasionally about having a directory of people. If you're going to talk about internationalization, include this person. If you're going to talk about accessibility, include this person. But we haven't quite gotten to doing that yet. It might be the right thing to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, but then your new problem is you have to maintain that database of people to go talk to, which never works.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way that we've solved it is, like I said, we've before it was you kind of came and you said, I want to do an architecture review, and we did a workshop, which was a smaller group of just the ARWG and then the folks involved in the project. And then the next step after that would be basically all of engineering is invited. And we've added this other step before that, which is office hours, which is much more informal. You just drop by. You don't have to have a fully fleshed out proposal. You might just have something you want to talk about, a question that you have, and then we'll kind of help shepherd you through and say, okay, well, you should go talk to XYZ people and make sure that they're involved. And so I think for us, it's really more about making sure that like we're super open about who's on the ARWG. We're starting to rotate folks out. We're starting to make sure that we have more folks that are representative of a wider range of engineering backgrounds, like actually bringing people from product on to the ARWG, and just making sure that everything is out in the open, so that people can't think that it's all behind closed doors and smoky rooms. And
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Uh-oh.
It's all good. It's a softball. So I'm a believer that like you should write design docs for like every design decision you're making, writing for everything. And something I've been thinking about lately, because I want everybody to do this, is how the structure and content of these templates kind of affect or kind of shape who will actually use these things. So for example, like we moved to the cloud, and so of course we've started talking about cost-aware development, and I thought about maybe we should have a section in the doc for what are the cost implications of this thing, right? But you know, in my head, I'm like, yeah, it's just another section. If you don't need it, you just delete it. But for somebody who might not be super comfortable writing these things, it's another section that they've got to fill out. And it's like, oh, what are the cost implications? Now I've got to think about that. And is this even big enough to have cost implications? And so you mentioned that you had restructured your template a little bit to make it less intimidating. So I'm curious kind of what are the changes you made and like how you think about that generally?
So we got a bunch of people together in a room, and it was like a couple of people from different parts of product engineering. There was one person from mobile. There were, it was from I don't know. It was about 10 of us in the room, and we went through the document, and people said the things they hated. It was great. And the first one was the approvers section was right there at the top. And when you open a document and we're saying, write an RFC for lots of things, it's no big deal, just use it to frame your thoughts. And the first words you see are, who will approve this? It made people not want to do it. So we made the extremely technical change of dragging the approvers section down to the bottom. And that seemed to make a difference. One was people had kept adding sections. So exactly like this, like someone said, should we have a cost section? And I don't think we ended up adding that, because that's a really intimidating question. It's like, how do you quantify this is going to take somebody working on it, and like what is a fully loaded engineer salary? And when people start to think about that, what's the cost of not doing it? And then they're like, this is just too hard. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to just go code. Coding is much more fun. And so people had added. I think this came to a head when someone added the sections at the bottom that were internal impact and external impact, which are great questions, but it was like the doc is now just too long. And someone had added stakeholders as well as reviewers, and what's the difference between? Okay, so the first thing was right at the top of the document. It now says delete any sections you don't think are relevant, and it says that big. We also increased the font size very slightly, so it feels a little more friendly.
That's some good UX.
Yeah, right? See, this is why we brought front-end people to the room, so they could be like,
yes.
yeah.
Make the logo bigger.
But it made people feel more comfortable with it. It had used to say approvers, and underneath it said other reviewers. I'm like, what does other reviewers mean? And so that wasn't solving the problem of who do you want to tell about this? So we changed that to stakeholders, which people now, I don't know, I didn't feel super great with the word stakeholders. I didn't understand it really. Or I don't have a hardware understanding of the word. It doesn't mean something to me, but it meant something to lots of people. And so they were more comfortable with that than reviewers. And this is like a bunch of other stuff we did. Like making everything optional was the big one, I think. To say, use what you want. And for dependencies, we had said, what systems do you depend on? Which is like such an infrastructure thing to say. It's like, and we changed it to like, what libraries belonging to other people might you want to modify? It's like, there's a little more understanding that the rest of the world exists. Yeah. So, thank you.
Well, I think that wraps it up for us. Thank you so much, Tanya. This was wonderful. I think we had an awesome discussion. Thank you, everyone. And Mike, I don't know if there's anything else that I should.
Tanya, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was really great.
Thank you.